Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
Welcome, everyone, to episode number 40 of Riskology by Infortal, a milestone for us here at hitting episode 40. And as we celebrate most milestone episodes, we've got a special guest joining us today. We have Frank Lavin, who is currently a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, has an illustrious career in government. You know, he's had posts with the White House. He served as an ambassador to Singapore, Undersecretary of Commerce. He's written several books, including a book on e-commerce in China, and he's got his own column at Forbes. Frank, welcome to the podcast, and so glad you can join us for episode 40.
Chris, thanks for having me on. It's great to chat with you today, and delighted to talk about Riskology and international business.
Yeah, great to have you here. And we hit a lot of different topics under the risk umbrella, and we look at investment overseas and a lot of the different issues that sort of come up when you're doing those types of investment activities. And we thought it would be great to start there and get some of your perspective based on your years of experience on working with companies that are looking to enter into new markets after they've been successful here in the United States, really looking to grow overseas. What are some of the challenges or misses that you think companies have when they start to look at expanding overseas?
Sure. Look, every company's got to come to terms with this because, as you observe, sooner or later, they start to become to maturity in the home market or growth starts to taper off. And there's also can be some good news in the picture, meaning they out of the blue, they'll get an order or interest from a foreign market. So all of a sudden, they'll find out folks in Brazil sort of like our product, or somebody in Korea is ordering our product. They just found it through the website or social media. So that's a very nice indicator that this product has some kind of appeal beyond the home market borders, but you have to turn that into a sort of serious undertaking that you're going to try to make something of it. And every company has a different appetite and different capabilities in that regard. My only observation is don't stand still. The world's not standing still. Your competitors aren't standing still. Consumers aren't standing still. So don't simply say, boy, I finally got to this level of maturity in the United States. I guess I'm done. And think about how you could move into a new market with the least amount of tension and pain and cost and the most upside. For a lot of Americans, that's Canada and Mexico, since they're close and somewhat similar, and you can get there easily and sort of sort through issues easily. But some more ambitious people look at Asia or look at Britain or other places in Europe.
Yeah, I think that's some really great insight. And one of our guests once explained that a good way of looking at entering a new market or a new country is understanding that you really need a guide. Just like if you're traveling, just like if you're going on sort of an adventure vacation, you need a guide to really show you what the risks are, what the pain points are, and make sure that they can keep you safe. Similarly, with business, you really got to have that insider knowledge of the local markets, local conditions. Ian, I thought maybe you want to give your perspective. You know, I know you're situated in Southern California, and there's a lot of sort of cross-border business there. What are your thoughts in terms of the outlook for 2025?
I think it's hard to say. There's a lot going on. I mean, obviously, California, especially Southern California, physically, I'm situated right at a crossroads between things moving out of North America, in from Asia, and North and South between the US and Mexico. I'm literally like sitting in the middle of a hub. And there's all this, especially since the election, and who knows how serious this is, of discussion about the US retaking control of the Panama Canal or somehow appropriating Greenland or a merger with Canada. Whether or not that's serious, I really can't say one way or the other. I don't discount anything after the past 10 years, but it's an interesting thought experiment. What would that do to trade? Because we've always sort of looked since the 1990s to East Asia, and we've had dynamics such as the European Union that have emerged in this sort of post-Cold War era, and it feels like we're at an epochal sort of turning point. It kind of has that feel to it. It's interesting to sort of war game out what would that be like if Canada and Greenland and the U.S. sort of came together in an economic sense. We can leave the politics aside for a second, but what would that do to markets? What would that do to energy, commodities? What would that do to the prominence of the dollar? What would that do to businesses in Canada and the U.S. particularly? Would that be inbound investment or outbound investment? What would that actually look like if such a merger, quote unquote, took place? I think it's an interesting thought experiment. So I would love to kick that over to Frank ask what that would be like. 2025, I think it's a lot of excitement and a lot of trepidation.
Yeah. Well, what I would tell an operating business that was looking at new markets is you need to approach a new market with an all-weather strategy because as you comment suggest a hint, there might be bad weather. And what none of us are in the business of is predicting the weather. The mistake would be to say, I'm going to precisely replicate my U.S. model in Mexico or Brazil or wherever. That would be the mistake because you're bringing in a lot of complexity and a lot of cost, a lot of maturity. Now, maybe over time, maybe over 10 years, you do more or less replicate that, but you don't need to enter that new market with 100% build out. You use a distributor, you can use a franchisee model, you can have a more limited slate of products introduced. One way of asking the question is, what is the least I have to do in Mexico to have a footprint and a sales team there and distribution team there that allow me to access the market? Not how do I replicate my U.S. apparatus? And when you think about it, this U.S. company might be 50 years old. So they took 50 years to get there. It's not, I think, necessary to say we're going to duplicate that in 12 months in Mexico, but to say, if I've got 80 products I sell in the United States, maybe these top 6 are the best selling ones, and maybe I'm going to start just in Mexico City, just with these 6. So I'm going to have a very light footprint, and then it will pay for itself. As I build out sales, build out revenue, I can expand organically in the Mexican market, but I don't need to invest nationally in the entire country of Mexico and build out warehouse distribution, truckings, personnel, and so forth, because sales might grow slowly.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it. And I think important as well when you start thinking of timelines, right? If you think of a company that's got a massive or extensive track record here in the United States, they can demonstrate success. They've got a deep bench in terms of how to do business here in the US. That may be a lot more difficult once you start entering into new markets. And so thinking about what your actual timeline should look like is important because you may not be able to move quite as fast as you want. And I think experimenting a little bit's a good way of sort of testing the waters there. Last time we met and we spoke, Frank, you mentioned that sometimes companies will contact you after they've gone abroad and they've really discovered that, hey, they had no idea what they were about to face. Maybe you can walk us through one of those scenarios and sort of explain how companies can walk it back.
Well, companies usually start thinking about international activity on the back of home market success, that something's really working. The product works, the brand works, the pricing works, the team works. So the whole business model in the U.S. market really works. And they're saying, boy, we think we could take this to the new market as well. Maybe so, maybe not, because consumer tastes will be different. Business practices will be different. The competitive map will be different. Purchasing power will be different. So there still could be a lot of logic and a lot of appeal in that product, but it might not be the same intensity or the same way that you experience in the home market. This is kind of your point, Chris, a minute ago about you need a guide. Another way of expressing that same sentiment, you need a guide, is do some discovery in that market. If I were going to Mexico, I'd say, look, I'm going to spend a long weekend in Mexico City, and I'm going to look at all of my competitors and what they're doing, and I'm going to go to the local college, and I'm going to get somebody from the Spanish language club who's a marketing major, and I'm going to say, I want you to study the social media footprint of my competitors in Mexico, Spanish language activity. I want you to study what they've done over the last 90 days on social media and come back and give me a report. How many followers do they have? What platforms they are? What themes do they use? I want to say, how do I fit in against these competitors? So you owe it to yourself to do a little bit of analysis on that market and not just show up. We say showing up isn't a strategy. Showing up is what you do if you don't have a strategy. So get a guide or speak to AmCham or talk to your state government. Typically has a trade office. There's a U.S. Commerce Department. There's trade missions, trade fairs, trade shows. But put a little bit of investment in trying to understand what the heck is going on in Mexico.
Yeah, you're definitely speaking our language now, doing that upfront analysis. And what we focus on as a company is on more of the due diligence side. And I'm just thinking, as we think about entering a new market and you take those first few steps, you don't need to completely reinvent the wheel. You don't need to recreate your company overseas. You can partner with other providers, service providers overseas. The only caveat there is you really need to make sure you have a handle on who you're doing business with. And I know, Ian, that's something that you've looked at pretty recently in terms of the risks there. What do you think going into 2025 with all of the geopolitical turmoil? What do you think some of the major risk factors will be in terms of vetting partners?
I think that's always a critical thing when you have to vet third-party partners. I think it becomes more complex when you're looking at new markets because you're sort of blending due diligence with market intelligence. You want to know who you're doing business with. You want to know your competitors and your market, but there's secret ingredients and risks to all those competitors due to cultural factors, due to corruption in some cases, due to legal peculiarities, and just geographic position and a whole host of things that can affect that market outlook. So those are the things that sort of the intelligence side can actually uncover and lend additional layers of benefit to actual market intelligence. So I think now in 2025, you need to read or double down on doing that practice. I know, for example, the EU is mandating geopolitical stress tests for their banking industry. That's kind of a new thing. You need to check third-party suppliers and supply chains for European companies when it comes to human rights, etc. Even within Europe itself, what happens if the EU suddenly massively reforms? That's a possibility. That could totally alter market positions. Now, of course, I'm talking about Europe here, but the same thing would be true in the Middle East. What happens when this war is over? If Iran actually changes regime, if it doesn't implode, does it become a part of the IMEC with India and sort of the Abraham Accords and everything like that, where it actually becomes a viable market? What happens to China? China has its own economic issues. It's putting arbitrary, politically motivated sort of restrictions on U.S. companies there, and a lot of American companies are pulling out. So when you add all this up, you sort of kind of need to keep your ear to the ground, and that's where the intelligence comes in, because you can't just take a still snapshot unless you're really blessed with a stable locale where the market intelligence is not perpetually in flux like it is right now. It's always in flux, but we're talking about major shifts potentially. So I think you need to reevaluate what you're looking at. If you need a fractional risk officer, maybe that's something that you should actually look at for geopolitics.
Yeah, keeping a pulse on the shifting dynamics, I think will be key, not only in 2025, but I think the next few years will be critical in terms of what the future of world trade is going to look like. With your deep experience in government in a lot of different areas, Frank, I'd love to get your take on sort of where you see some of these major tectonic geopolitical shifts going.
I see long-term good news, Chris, but I'm very much in Ian's corner to say in the short run, there can be a lot of volatility and shocks, and there can be bad weather. But by the long-term good news, I mean the trend over the last few decades has been growing global prosperity. So there's a global consumer base now that is 2, 3, 4 times what it was a generation ago. So it makes sense to talk to the world and connect with the world, because they want, people in Nigeria like Nike shoes for the same reason Americans like Nike shoes, because they're great shoes, right? So there's a global consumer market and a global degree of prosperity that's unknown. So you want to be able to fit into that. And the second element of that is the rise of digital communication and decline in logistics, meaning your ability to talk and work with that person in Nigeria is open-ended and more or less cost-free. Your ability to have a Zoom call with them or email that person or say, let's talk about next month's orders. Whereas, a generation or two ago, you might say, look, I don't know anything about Nigeria, and I'm not going to get to Nigeria, and I'm not all that interested in it. So the long-term trends are pretty positive. In the short run, Ian is exactly right. You're going to have political shocks and economic dislocation. So I would still encourage people to have sort of a light touch, light CapEx investment strategy. And I would say to that, if you normally, for example, in the United States, if you say in order to distribute in the United States, we have 12 warehouses and 100 trucks, I'd say that's cool. That's fine. You don't need to do any of that overseas. You do not need to own warehouses. You do not need to own trucks. And you might be better off, I think you would be better off if you outsource that, give up some of your profit, give up some of your net, but you're saying, boy, I don't have to worry. I don't have to worry if my warehouse utilization is at 40% or there's a trucker strike, or that's my problem. And I can't go to Mexico and solve a warehouse problem the way you could solve it maybe in the United States. So I don't want that extra set of headaches. So I'm going to go for a light footprint, light CapEx approach to foreign markets.
I like it. I think when you consider the communication piece through the advancements in technology, there are a lot more options. And again, we mentioned it before, you don't have to completely start up a new company overseas. You can partner and you can work with a logistics firm that has everything that you need to facilitate your process. So again, it's really looking at what's available and then making sure you do that proper sort of vetting ahead of time. I'd like to sort of shift gears just a little bit because, a few clients have approached us before and discussed sort of how they can get help from different government agencies. And as a former Fed myself, I know it can be really daunting to approach the massive bureaucracy that's currently there today. I know there's some plans being talked about where things could shift post January 20th. But What would you say if you're a business looking to go overseas? What are some great resources that come to mind for you, Frank, in terms of where people can tap into the federal government?
Yeah, I would definitely look at the commercial service in the embassy, a U.S. embassy, I mean, of the country, whether it's Mexico City or Istanbul. The point is, all of the embassies have a commercial officer and they're there to help. Now, as you point out, that can be uneven and there can be communication delays, but at least I would knock on their door. And they frequently have working groups with the American Chamber of Commerce. If you said, I've got to go to Turkey and I've got to open up a restaurant, my U.S. pizza chain is booming. It's incredible. We're now in Europe where I'm the guy in charge of Turkey. By the way, that's fantastic news and it probably makes a lot of sense. But I would sit down with other restaurant operators in Turkey and I would say, you came from Britain, you came from Germany, you came from the U.S. What lessons did you learn in terms of health inspections, zoning laws, labor laws? What were the big shifts, differences between German fast food places and Turkish? But you'll get sort of free consultation from like-minded individuals, right? So I would go down that path with the American Chamber, with the of Commerce, and with the commercial officer in the U.S. Embassy. I'd also look at the state level, Chris, just to finish off the question, because a lot of states will have state governors or state development officers that do trade missions. And I think California does one a year to Mexico, which they should. And other states probably do something similar. So those are great to hop out. And you just it's familiarization tours. You'll get a briefing from a U.S. bank in Mexico. You'll get the McKinsey guy or somebody to talk to you about the marketplace. So it's not a bad sort of crash course on what the heck's going on in Mexico.
Yeah, and I think, the biggest upside with a lot of those resources you just mentioned is there's no cost involved. It's a case of having the conversations, making the contacts, and going into the events.
Can I just offer another point on, this is outside of government, but depending on the size of this company and what its footprint is in the United States, we've frequently seen situations where you can go to your home bank in the U.S. and say, I want to talk with your colleague in Mexico City. I'm going to be there in 2 weeks. Can you send that fellow an email? Can I come by and pay a call on that guy? And if you're dealing with one of the majors that happens to have a branch network or some kind of a commercial setup in Mexico as well as here, that's a great entry. But I've done the same thing with accounting firms, with law firms, et cetera. It's always catch as catch can, because the law firm might say, look, we don't have a Mexico City branch, but they might say, we do have an affiliate office there, and I can send the fellow an email. If you want to go by and have coffee with the fellow, go knock on his door. But every one of these nodes can be a little source of information for you. And as you point, it's a guide. Somebody has one piece of the jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, I love that. Well, we're coming up on time here. It's flying by. We've hit a lot of coverage. I guess to close it out, let's think of 2025. Ian, where do you think the biggest investment opportunities will be for American firms?
For American firms, I would actually, if things play out, I could see the U.S. itself actually becoming a better destination. Whereas 10 years ago, it looked very different. I could see that being the case for not only American companies, but for companies overseas.
Overseas, yeah.
As well. I could see specific parts of the U.S., especially in key industries, for sure. So if I had to put money down, that's where it would be.
How about you, Frank? Where do you think there's going to be some more activity as we head into 2025?
And Chris, if you don't mind, I take that question a little differently. I would tell new companies in the market, don't focus exclusively or primarily on upside. What's the best opportunity? I would focus primarily on downside. What is the lowest risk? What is the easiest market for me to operate in? Meaning, that's why I keep mentioning Canada and Mexico, because you're close to them, you're familiar to them. If there's a problem, you can fly in, you can meet people there. And so the point is, Canada is not a strategic market. But if you've never done FX before, if you've never done customs clearance before, if you've never dealt with a problem in a foreign market before, Canada is great. Canada is great because you're so familiar with it. It's so similar to the U.S. You'll feel very, very comfortable there. And you'll say, guess what? The issues we're seeing in Canada are 95% similar to what we're seeing in the U.S. So it's just consistent with your skill set. So that's what I would tell first timers to do. Don't make the mistake of saying China's the biggest market on the planet or India's the biggest population on the planet, so I'm going to go to China, because those are reasonably complicated markets. Don't aim for complexity, aim for simplicity for your first time around the block.
I think that's great advice and a great way to cap off the episode. Frank, we hope you can join us again in 2025 so we can sort of regroup after the new administration takes shape.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.